The sky went yellow at noon. Birdie Holst saw it first. She was sitting by the window of the sod schoolhouse copying a passage from the reader when the light changed, shifting from the flat gray of a Dakota winter morning to something the color of old bruises. She had lived on the plains since she was 6 years old, and she knew what that color meant. Her father had told her. Her grandfather had told her father. Yellow sky in January means the air is about to tear itself apart. "Miss Fairchild," Birdie said, "the sky's turned." Agnes Fairchild looked up from the slate where she was writing arithmetic problems for the younger children. She was 29 years old, and she had been on the Dakota prairie for 3 years, and in that time, she had learned to respect two things she had never thought about in Massachusetts: wind and distance. Wind because it never stopped, and distance because it could kill you. She walked to the window and looked at the sky and felt something tighten in her stomach. The schoolhouse was a sod building, 12 feet by 16, with walls 3 feet thick made of prairie grass and dirt cut into bricks and stacked like masonry. It had a plank door, 2 small windows with oiled paper instead of glass, a cast iron stove in the center, and a dirt floor covered with straw. It was ugly and low, and it smelled like earth and wood smoke and the wet wool of 7 children's coats drying by the stove. It was also the warmest building for 3 miles in any direction, and on a day when the sky turned yellow, warm was the only thing that mattered. "Everyone stay inside," Agnes said. "Birdie, bring in the rest of the wood from the lean-to." There were 7 children in the schoolhouse that day. Birdie and her brother Eric, the Mackey twins, Amos and Abel, who were 10 and did everything together, including getting the wrong answer on the same arithmetic problem at the same time. Little Josephine Pratt, who was 8 and so quiet that Agnes sometimes forgot she was there until she turned a page. Tommy Lund, who was 9 and had not stopped talking since September, and Ruthie Garza, the youngest at 7, who had walked 3 miles through the snow that morning because her father believed that education was worth frozen toes. Birdie hauled in armloads of split wood from the lean-to while the wind began to pick up. By the time she finished, the first snow was already moving across the prairie in low white sheets that looked like smoke running along the ground. Within 20 minutes, the windows went white and the world outside disappeared. The blizzard hit the schoolhouse like a fist, and the walls shook and the stove flue howled, and the children went quiet, the way children go quiet when the world outside reminds them that it is bigger and older and less interested in their survival than they had assumed. Agnes kept them calm. She read aloud from the book of poems she carried everywhere, Longfellow and Whittier, and verses about summer and green fields and things that had nothing to do with a sod building shaken in a Dakota blizzard. She kept the stove burning. She rationed the lunches the children had brought, dividing the bread and dried meat into portions that would last until the storm broke or until someone came for them, whichever happened first. The wood ran out at 4 o'clock. Birdie had brought in everything from the lean-to, but the lean-to had only held enough for a normal day, and this was not a normal day. The stove ate wood the way the prairie ate distance, steadily and without mercy, and by late afternoon, the fire was burning the last split log, and the temperature inside the schoolhouse was dropping, and the children were huddled together on the floor, wrapped in every coat and blanket in the building. Agnes made a decision. The coal shed was 60 yards from the schoolhouse, a small dugout where Silas Drummond stored coal for the school, because he was the only rancher close enough to haul it. 60 yards. She could see the shed on a clear day from the schoolhouse door. She had walked to it 100 times since September, carrying a bucket in each hand, counting her steps out of habit, the way you count anything you do, often enough. 60 yards was nothing. It was the distance from her boarding house in Massachusetts to the church on the corner. It was the kind of distance a person covers without thinking about it, The kind of distance that only becomes dangerous when the world between here and there disappears. But this was not a clear day. This was a blizzard that had turned the world into a white wall of moving ice, and 60 yards in a Dakota blizzard might as well be 60 miles. Agnes knew this. She had read about the blizzards in the papers back east before she came west. She had heard the stories from the ranchers about men found frozen 10 steps from their own front doors. She knew the danger the way a person knows fire is hot, as a fact, not as a feeling. The feeling would come later, when the fact was no longer abstract. She looked at the children. Ruthie Garza was pressed against Birdie's side with her face buried in Birdie's coat. Tommy Lund had gone quiet, which was more frightening than any blizzard. The Mackey twins were holding hands the way they did when they were scared, which they would deny later. Little Josephine was staring at the stove with the expression of a child watching something die. Eric was feeding the last scraps of straw into the firebox, and the straw was burning too fast, flaring and vanishing, giving heat that lasted seconds instead of hours. She didn't tell the children what she was going to do. She told Birdie to keep everyone together and keep the stove door closed to hold whatever heat was left. She put on her shawl and her bonnet and wrapped a scarf around her face and opened the door. The wind hit her like a wall of sand made of ice. She couldn't see the coal shed. She couldn't see anything except white, a roaring white nothing that filled her eyes and her mouth and her lungs and erased every landmark and every direction and every certainty she had ever held about where things were in relation to other things. She stepped out and closed the door behind her. She walked into the blizzard, counting her steps the way her father had taught her to count measures in music, steady and even, and one at a time. 60 yards was about 180 steps in her stride. She counted to 50, and the schoolhouse behind her was gone. She counted to 100, and the world was nothing but wind and snow and the sound of her own breathing inside the scarf. She counted to 180 and reached for the coal shed door, and her hand found nothing. Empty air, snow, the howling absence of a building that should have been there. She had walked the wrong way. She didn't know it yet. The wind had pushed her off course, 10 degrees, maybe 15, just enough to miss the coal shed by 30 feet, which in a blizzard is the same as 30 miles. She stood in the white nothing and turned in a circle and saw nothing in any direction and felt the cold climbing through her boots and her shawl and her dress and settling into her bones with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. She made a second decision. She turned around and tried to walk back. She counted her steps again, 180, and reached for the schoolhouse door and found nothing. The wind had shifted, or she had drifted, or both. She was lost in 60 yards of open prairie, with the temperature dropping and the snow filling her tracks as fast as she made them, and the 2 buildings that could save her life invisible and silent somewhere in the white. Inside the schoolhouse, Birdie Holst waited. She waited 10 minutes. She waited 20. She put more straw on the stove, and the straw burned fast and hot and then was gone. And the cold crept in through the walls, and the children pressed closer together, and little Ruthie Garza started to cry, not from fear but from the cold, which was worse because there was nothing Birdie could say to make the cold stop. At 30 minutes, Birdie made her own decision. She was 14 years old, and she had lived on the Dakota Plains for 8 years, and she knew 2 things that Miss Fairchild did not know. She knew that the wind in a Dakota blizzard always comes from the northwest, and she knew that the coal shed was due south of the schoolhouse. She told Eric to keep everyone together. She took the rope that held the lean-to door shut and tied one end to the schoolhouse door frame. She wrapped the other end around her waist. The rope was 40 feet long, not enough to reach the coal shed, but enough to keep her connected to the building while she searched. She opened the door and stepped into the blizzard. The wind hit her from the left, which meant northwest, which meant south was to her right. She walked with the rope paying out behind her, counting steps, her left hand held out in front of her and her right hand on the rope. When the rope ran out, she stopped and swept her arm in a wide arc and felt nothing. She pulled herself back to the schoolhouse, hand over hand, and tried again, angling 5 degrees further south. On the third try, her hand hit wood, the coal shed wall. She found the door by feel, wrenched it open, and filled her coat with as many chunks of coal as she could carry. Then she followed the rope back to the schoolhouse and dumped the coal by the stove and went out again. 3 trips, 40 feet out, 40 feet back, each time following the rope like a lifeline, which is what it was. The stove came back to life. The coal burned slow and hot and steady, and the temperature inside the schoolhouse climbed back from deadly to merely miserable, and the children stopped shivering, and Ruthie stopped crying, and Tommy Lund started talking again, which meant things were going to be all right. But Miss Fairchild was still outside. Birdie tied a longer rope, knotting together the lean-to rope and the clothesline, and a length of harness leather from the supply box. 60 feet. She went out again, this time heading northwest, into the wind, because if Miss Fairchild had walked out the door and been pushed by the wind, she would have drifted south and east, away from the coal shed, away from the schoolhouse, into the open prairie where there was nothing between the school and the town of Cedar Bluff, 15 miles away, except grass and snow and death. She found the tracks at 40 feet. They were almost gone, just shallow depressions in the snow that were filling fast. But Birdie could feel them with her boots, the way you feel a path through tall grass even when you can't see it. The tracks went south and east, then circled back north, then wandered west. The pattern of a person who had lost direction and was walking in loops, which is what people do in a blizzard because the human body pulls slightly to one side and without a landmark to correct against, every straight line becomes a circle. She followed the tracks as far as the rope would let her, and then she stopped and shouted. The wind took her voice and shredded it. She shouted again. Nothing. She pulled herself back to the schoolhouse and added more rope, another 20 feet of harness leather, and went out again. She found Agnes Fairchild 80 feet from the schoolhouse, sitting in the snow with her back against a low rise in the ground that might have been a buried fence post or a drift, or just the prairie itself offering one small piece of shelter. Her shawl was frozen stiff, the wool turned to something closer to wood than fabric. Her bonnet was gone, torn away by the wind somewhere in her wandering. Her hair was loose and crusted with ice. Her hands were inside her sleeves, pulled up like a child trying to disappear into their own coat. Her eyes were closed and her skin had gone the color of candle wax, and she was not shivering, which was the worst sign because it meant her body had stopped fighting the cold and had started surrendering to it. Birdie's father had told her about this. When a person stops shivering in the cold, it doesn't mean they're warm. It means the body has given up trying. Birdie grabbed her under the arms and pulled. Agnes was not a large woman, but dead weight is heavier than living weight, and the snow was deep and the wind was pushing against them, and Birdie was 14 years old and weighed 90 pounds. She pulled and dragged and hauled and talked the entire time, shouting words that the wind stole before they reached anyone's ears, telling Miss Fairchild to wake up, to stand up, to help, to fight, to not be dead because the younger children needed her. And Birdie was not old enough to teach arithmetic, and Tommy Lund would never learn to read if she wasn't there to make him sit still. She got Agnes to the door, Eric opened it from inside, and between them they dragged the schoolteacher across the threshold and laid her on the floor by the stove and piled every coat and blanket in the building on top of her. Birdie rubbed her hands. Josephine heated water in a tin cup on the stove and held it to her lips. The Mackey twins lay on either side of her like bookends, pressing their small warm bodies against hers, because that was what their mother had told them to do if anyone ever got too cold. And their mother knew, because she had survived a blizzard herself the year they were born. Agnes Fairchild opened her eyes 2 hours later. The world came back slowly. First the heat, the deep, steady heat of coal burning in cast iron, not the quick flare of straw, but the slow, patient warmth that seeps into frozen bones and convinces them to stay alive. Then the sound. The wind still howling outside, but muffled now by 3 feet of sod wall, and beneath it the smaller sounds of children breathing and shifting and whispering the way children whisper when they're waiting for something important to happen. Then the faces, 7 of them, arranged in a circle above her like small moons, each one wearing the expression children wear when they have been more frightened than they will ever admit, and are only now beginning to believe the frightening part is over. "Birdie," Agnes said. Her voice was raw and barely there. "You went the wrong way," Birdie said. "Your tracks went south. The coal shed is due south, but you went southeast. The wind pushed you." "How did you find me?" "Rope. I tied it to the door and walked out and followed your tracks." Agnes looked at the ceiling of the sod schoolhouse, the rough underside of the planks that held the grass and dirt roof in place, and she thought about the 60 yards she had tried to cross and the 180 steps she had counted, and the white nothing that had swallowed every direction and every landmark and every certainty she had. She thought about a 14-year-old girl who had tied a rope to a door and walked into the same blizzard and found the coal shed by knowing which way the wind blew, and found her teacher by following tracks that were disappearing under fresh snow. "I came here to teach you," Agnes said. "You did teach us," Birdie said. "I'm the best reader in the territory, but reading doesn't tell you which way the wind blows. The prairie teaches you that." The blizzard broke at dawn. The sky cleared to a blue so bright it hurt, and the snow lay across the prairie, in drifts taller than a man, and the world was silent the way the world is silent after a storm, as if the land is holding its breath to see what survived. Silas Drummond arrived at the schoolhouse on horseback at 8 in the morning, his buffalo hide coat white with frost and his face red with cold and fear. He had ridden 3 miles through chest-deep drifts because he knew there were children in that building, and he knew what a blizzard like that could do to a sod schoolhouse with a day's worth of wood. He found the door frozen shut and kicked it open and saw 7 children and their teacher sitting by a hot stove, drinking water heated in tin cups, alive and warm and together. He looked at the coal by the stove. He looked at the rope still tied to the doorframe, trailing out through the snow like a lifeline to somewhere. He looked at Birdie Holst, who was sitting by the window reading a passage from the reader as if nothing had happened. "Who got the coal?" he asked. "Birdie," Agnes said. "Birdie got the coal. Birdie found me. Birdie kept them alive." Silas looked at the 14-year-old girl with the tight blonde braid and the jaw set like her father's. "How?" "Rope and wind," Birdie said. "The wind comes from the northwest. The coal shed is south. Miss Fairchild's tracks went southeast. It wasn't complicated." Silas Drummond had lived on the Dakota plains for 23 years. He had lost cattle and horses and 2 sons and a piece of his heart that would never grow back. He had seen blizzards strip the land to bare frozen earth, and he had seen men walk out of their own front doors and die 10 feet from the threshold because they turned the wrong way in the snow. And now he was standing in a sod schoolhouse looking at a child who had done with a rope and a knowledge of wind what grown men with lanterns and search parties could not do. He didn't say anything. He took off his hat and held it against his chest and stood there for a moment, and that was enough. He had buried 2 sons on this prairie. He knew what it looked like when the land decided to take someone, and he knew what it looked like when someone decided to take them back. One was a tragedy, the other was a miracle. And miracles on the Dakota plains didn't come from the sky. They came from rope and wind, and a 14-year-old girl who refused to let the cold have the last word. He helped Agnes to his horse and rode her to his ranch, where his wife wrapped her feet in warm cloths and fed her broth and didn't ask questions, because ranch wives on the Dakota plains knew that questions could wait until the shaking stopped. The parents came for their children throughout the morning, arriving on horseback and on foot, and in one case on a sled pulled by a mule, each one wild with the particular terror of a parent who has spent a night not knowing. Each one found their child alive. Each one heard the story. And each one looked at Birdie Holst and then at Agnes Fairchild, and understood that what had happened in the schoolhouse was a lesson that no reader or arithmetic book could teach. Agnes Fairchild stayed in Dakota territory. She lost 2 toes on her left foot to frostbite, and she walked with a slight limp for the rest of her life, a reminder with every step that 60 yards in the wrong direction is the distance between living and dying. She taught at the sod schoolhouse for 11 more years. She never went outside in a blizzard again, but she kept a rope coiled by the door for the rest of her teaching career, and every new student who walked into her classroom learned 2 things on the first day. The first was the alphabet. The second was which way the wind blows. Birdie Holst grew up on the Dakota plains and became a teacher herself. She taught at a schoolhouse 30 miles from the one where she had dragged her frozen teacher through the snow, and on the wall behind her desk she kept a coil of rope and a small hand-drawn map showing the direction of the prevailing wind. Her students asked about it every year, and every year she told the story, and every year the story ended the same way. The prairie doesn't care if you're brave. It doesn't care if you're kind. It only cares if you know which way the wind blows. And if you know that, you can find your way back from anywhere.